Okay, we'll start the live stream in 1 minute, Jana.
Okay.
Good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to our webinar series, Experts Speak, in association with the International Association for Business Analytics Certification. And today we have our founder of IBSA, Mr. Hans Bokers. He's joining us from the Netherlands. And today he'll be introducing our speaker for today, Ms. Jana. Over to you, Hans.
Yes, thank you. Hi, ladies and gentlemen. I am Hans Volkers, co-founder of IBEC in the Netherlands in 2018. It is my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker today, Dr. Jana Lipenkova, joining us today from Berlin. Jana is an experienced AI entrepreneur with a strong academic foundation. She holds a PhD in computational linguistics and has spent many years working with AI and NLP in both academia and industry. She's the co-founder and CEO of Anacode and also leads Equintel, two analytics companies that use artificial intelligence to turn complex data into clear, actionable business intelligence. Through this work, she helps organizations identify real AI opportunities, design robust solutions, and translate them into measurable business impact. Her focus is very much on one central question: how do you move from promising AI ideas to scalable products that genuinely create value? What I personally appreciate in her profile is the combination of deep technical expertise with an international and very human perspective. Jana speaks several languages, has worked across cultures, and is used to building bridges between data scientists, product teams, and business stakeholders. In her talks, she regularly emphasizes user experience, responsible use of AI, and the importance of connecting technology to strategy and day-to-day decisions. That makes her not only an expert on AI systems, but also a guide for organizations that want people and intelligent systems to work together in a thoughtful way. In today's session, Jana will share practical perspectives on how to spot the right AI opportunities and take them all the way to implementation, drawing on her experience in AI product development and business intelligence. I invite you to listen with both curiosity and a critical eye, and to think about how her insights can be translated into your own context after this webinar. With that, it's my great pleasure to hand over to Dr. Jana Lipenkova. Jana, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Hans, for this introduction. Hi, everyone. I will share my presentation and then we can start. Can you see the presentation?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So in today's talk, I would like to focus around the topic of AI discovery. So basically selecting the right use cases and opportunities for AI in your business, and doing that in a structured and data-driven way. The talk is based on two main references, which are also publicly accessible. So on the one hand, it's my book that was published last year. It's called The Art of AI Product Development, and it describes a whole methodology starting with AI discovery, then through the whole development and implementation and up into adoption in organizations. And then the AI Radar, so that's a new tool that we launched 2 months ago. It's publicly accessible. And then in the talk, you will also basically get a glimpse into the tool. You can also try it out yourself. So that's really a data-driven tool that allows you to discover AI use cases and then also to start building your system architectures to design the systems that you would need to build in order to implement these use cases. The agenda for the talk. So first, there's a lot of hype around AI at the moment, right? And AI is eating the world. But I would like to start with a quick AI reality check about what's actually done in companies. There's a lot to say about it, but we will just look at a couple of snapshots. And then I would like to give you these two tools for AI discovery, right? So basically the first one is the AI opportunity tree. So that's a mental model or a framework that you can use for a structured AI ideation. And then the second one, as said, is the AI Radar. So that's a data-driven online tool that you can really use to browse different use cases, assess them, learn more about them, and so on. And then we will close with a short feedback and a Q&A session. So first, the reality check. When you read the news and when you look at the websites of companies and so on, then of course we have the impression that everyone is fully transforming themselves with AI now, and there are plenty of successful agents and AI models and so on that are built. But actually, when you then look more closely at the data and you look beyond all those prototypes and demos and all that excitement, then you see that a lot of the use cases and projects are not successful in the sense of making it into production and into sustainable adoption, right? If you want to be successful with AI, you need adoption, you need people who are using the tool. Today, what happens very often is that the tech team or the product team builds a product and then it doesn't get used because it's not aligned with the user expectations and so on. And thus, there is no critical feedback loop that would actually allow to take that AI system into production and into long-term adoption. So here on the slide, you can see one of the stats that are flying around online, right, which is basically by the RAND Corporation. It's from, it's already a bit dated, so it's from 1.5 years ago, I think. 80% of corporate AI initiatives fail, right? And the main reason for that is not that the models are not good enough or the engineers didn't do a good job, right? The main reason is that stakeholders actually choose the wrong problems for AI, right? So there is often this kind of myopia when we think about AI projects at the moment, right? We often tend to go into the direction of building some kind of chatbot or some kind of agent or doing what everyone else does, right? And that often basically blocks us after this demo or prototype phase, right? So what do we mean by wrong problems here? First, it can be problems that are maybe insignificant, right? So they are so small or maybe even so infrequent that in the end, nobody cares, right? You might get some budget, you might get some resources, but then as said, you don't really get into this long-term kind of thinking and of development and optimization, which would really make the product or the system good in the end. Then we have problems that are too simple, and these problems often can be solved in a more deterministic way, right? So they don't really need AI at all, right? So often we talk here about problems like, like just cleaning out your whole databases and so on. So oftentimes in these cases, you have a lot of deterministic tasks. Maybe you can use regular expressions or just some deterministic code to solve them. And then it's also much cheaper, right? So AI is always more expensive than deterministic code when applied to the same problem. And then we have problems that are too complex, right? And often this might also be some very infrequent tasks or decisions. For example, last time we had a request from a company that was like in a M&A process, mergers and acquisitions, and they wanted to automate the decision, right, or to significantly augment it with AI. Of course, you can use all the models to help you with the research and so on, but then in the end, that kind of decisions is so complex, so custom to the business, and also so infrequent, right, that it's not really worth engineering a whole AI system around it, right? So you really need to rely on some more manual workflows and then use those available AI tools to basically support you in your work, right? So these are some kinds of problems that are not a very good fit for AI, right? And that's why so yeah, just one of my favorite memes, right? So how this often plays out, you go into a meeting, there are multiple stakeholders, so you might have a, let's say, a manager there, then there is a tech guy, a UX designer, and so on. And then there is some kind of, very general idea about AI, right? So often it's just this kind of signal, let's use AI, right? Or as you can see here, let's transform our entire business using the generative AI I just used to write a poem about my dog, right? So you can see that oftentimes we see that these models, they are so amazing, so powerful, they sound like humans and so on, but then really getting them like into robust production at the company, it's a totally different story, right? So that's something that is always to keep in mind, right? Because we often really underestimate the complexity of the tasks that we are attacking. And then on the other hand, we also overestimate the performance and the reliability of the models and the AI systems we are building. So that's why it's a clear don't to jump straight into all those questions, which tools are we going to use, which models are we going to use, and so on, right? So all those kind of hype questions, because tools and models, they are changing anyway, right? And anyway, it's a good practice. Once you have clarity about the use case and you have clarity about the architecture, it's a good practice to build the architecture in a way that you can actually also interchange different tools and models whenever you have a better alternative or the older one basically doesn't fit your needs anymore. And instead, you need to allocate sufficient time and effort to AI discovery. And that's a question that has been kind of haunting me for the last 2 or 3 years, because I've been in AI for more than a decade now, or even 15 years. So before ChatGPT, I was working really in those specialized projects, right? So for AI companies and natural language processing projects and so on, where the goals were super clear and the technical requirements were also super clear. But then when AI came into this whole public space with ChatGPT at the end of 2022, all kinds of companies, of course, started jumping on this AI train, right? Even those companies that didn't have a foundation in AI or weren't even prepared, like in terms of their general digitalization strategy, in terms of their databases and so on. And since then, I have been really looking at all those patterns that they use when they make decisions about AI use cases, about AI projects, and kind of trying to systematize the process and to really develop good tools and good mental models to support them in that process as well. Right? So therefore, the question, how can we support AI discovery in a structured and data-driven way? Structured is important because that's something that allows you to create alignment in the organization, right? Normally, when you come into an organization and you talk to the business team, you talk to the tech team, you talk to the people who actually are the domain experts and so on, each of them normally has a different understanding of what AI is, right? And if you go into the specifics, like what is an AI agent for you, then it becomes even more differentiated, right? So that's why when you have a joint structure and you kind of have the shared language that you use in the company to talk about AI, it's much easier to align the different teams on what you're talking about. And then of course also to move more constructively toward the goal. And then the data-driven discovery, I think, is super important because, as you know, things are changing very quickly. We are all overwhelmed by a lot of information about AI. A lot of that information is not really credible, or it's hype, it's marketing by the companies and so on. So that's why I really believe that doing it in a data-driven way based on evidence is also important to ensure that you're successful further down the road. And with that, so let's come to the structured point first, right? So here I would like to show you a mental model, which is the AI opportunity tree, and which kind of allows you to structure and to classify all those use case ideas that might be floating around in your company. So normally when we do discovery, we start with the problem, right? So we go from problem to the solution, to the technical implementation of the solution, right? With AI, that's often not the case, right? So often there is this kind of pitfall and this kind of thinking where we go into the direction of just doing AI because of it, right? So it's also called AI for the sake of AI. So one thing that you can do to counteract that tendency in your company is basically to start from those big general benefits of the technology, right? So we're still at the level of talking about AI, but now we really think in terms of the benefits that it can actually bring to our business. And here on the slide, we see the 4 main categories of benefits, right? So first we have automation and productivity, right? So we have an existing process, like maybe something like invoice processing, right? Which is done at the company, it's done in a manual, inefficient way. And now we could use AI to speed it up, to make it more efficient and so on. Then we have improvement and augmentation. So that's already a bit more involved in terms of we also have an existing process. So let's say we are creating some marketing content, right? But then we can use AI to further improve and enrich it, right? Because, for example, for marketing content, AI can be helpful because it has access to broader databases. Maybe it can help us standardize our brand language and so on, right? So that's really taking an existing process and building on top of it and making it better AI. Then come the innovation use cases, and these are already a different kind of game, right? Because here we talk about creating new use cases, maybe new processes, new products in the organization. And, we often talk about this AI transformation that's happening to some companies, right? But eventually, it might sound like hype, right? But eventually it will happen. Some companies will transform themselves, right? So they will kind of get rid of all the manual overhead that they have, and then they will completely shift their business model, their products, and so on. And this is what you do when you're here in this innovation branch, right? So you really look at new products, new features, new processes, operating models, and so on, and you see how you can implement them with AI. And finally, we have personalization. So that's basically adapting your outputs, your actions, and so on to, like, let's say, customer segments of a size of 1, maybe, right? Or if you're talking about a business, then it would be the size of maybe a small team or a small department and so on. So really making your outputs much more tailored to the user, which also saves a lot of time because then the user doesn't need to spend all this time tailoring the outputs to themselves. I want to show you just a quick snapshot of how we applied this AI opportunity tree in an example project. So that was a project, or it is a project that we are conducting in the aviation industry with a major airline. And basically what we do here is, because airlines have a strong competitive pressure, right? When you go and look for flights, then you have many, many different options of airlines and you're basically free to choose. So that's why they also have a lot of pressure to innovate. So here, basically, we use AI to help them support their innovation processes, and specifically in those first stages of, kind of the research on the competitive landscape, on the available technologies and so on, then ideating good innovation opportunities for them, and then also starting to support them with their prototyping, with the testing, the conceptualization of the ideas and so on. Right? So here, basically, for each of these categories, you can see a couple of the use cases that we ideated with them at the beginning of the project, right? So for example, for automation and productivity, you would have competitor monitoring. That's something that they did manually initially. Now it's all automated, which means that we can cover much more data, right? Because the AI can work with the larger databases on the one hand, and then on the other hand, it also saves them a lot of time, right? So in general, when you think automation and productivity, of course, you always have this, kind of benefit top of mind, which is cost and time savings, right? So super it's likely it's also the easiest to quantify and the most tangible one. Then for improvement and augmentation, you could have something like identify and analyze relevant trends, right? So if before they had to consult with a consulting company, which would create them a trend report about the trends in the industry, and now it's also automated with AI, and so on and so forth, basically for innovation and personalization as well, right? So that's just an excerpt of a couple of use cases. Of course, the whole pool was bigger in real life because also the stakes of the project are high. In general, like in practical terms, so I have seen less success with those companies where, leadership basically gives the signal, let's do AI, and then every team will collect their potential AI use cases, right? Because then and then they will pool them, they will organize a workshop, and you will end up with 30 or 40 chatbots in the whole workshop, right? So that's the issue, basically, that then you often kind of end up with this bias. And also many of the use cases, they end up being like super similar to each other, but then also a bit different, right? And the dynamics that we also see in teams is that oftentimes people are very eager to try out things, to experiment, to prototype. It's also something that's made much easier today with vibe coding and all those agentic development tools. But then they're not willing to optimize their systems to maturity. And on the other hand, they also can't recruit all those people and all those users they would need in the organization to actually get them all those critical feedback and data and so on that they need to optimize the systems, right? So that's why we normally try to push our clients into the direction of a more centralized AI strategy, right? Where basically you can kind of, orchestrate all this development on the one hand, but then also the testing, the feedback loop, and so on. So coming back to the AI opportunity tree, actually here, so far we talked about ideation, which is kind of this very freestyle brainstorming exercise, right? But this opportunity tree also already gives you a hint for prioritization further down the road, right? So basically deciding which of these AI opportunities you want to tackle first. And here, our advice, it's not like prescriptive at all, it's super flexible, right? But the kind of the signal, the mainstream signals that we see is that it often makes sense to start on the left side with automation productivity, right? And then move towards the right side, right? So automation and productivity, in many companies, these are the low-hanging fruits. Normally, there are simple processes, so they are not so difficult in the technical perspective. They are difficult, but they are simpler than the other ones. As said, you can easily quantify them in terms of time and cost savings, right? And then basically, they're kind of the quick wins that allow you to build momentum, to build trust, and then based on this, you can evolve into the more complex and maybe also a bit less tangible use cases, right? And then on the other hand, if you want to transform your company in the long term, you absolutely need to automate, right? So you need to get rid of all this overhead that you might have in some inefficient processes, inefficient operating modes, and so on. Okay. So that was the mental model, the AI opportunity tree. It's described in the book, and there are also a couple of articles online that you can find about it. So if you're interested about the whole methodology and the whole thinking about it. And now I would like to come to the AI Radar, which is a tool that we have built for data-driven discovery, right? So really a discovery that's grounded in the real-world data, real-world case studies, and so on. And for that, I will jump into the demo. Just 1 second. Okay. So basically, it's publicly accessible, right? And we are also looking for testers, early users at the moment who are willing to provide feedback. And that's exactly the goal of the tool. So first, to allow you to explore use cases. And then on the other hand, we are also already going into this whole implementation area by analyzing all the technologies that are out there, the AI architectures, and so on. Let's start with the use cases, right? So let's say that I'm looking for use cases. You can search anything, right? But let's start broadly. So let's start with aviation. And then you can see a bunch of use cases here, like autonomous flying, in-flight entertainment, security screening, and so on, right? So let's maybe go on one of them. Let's look at fleet optimization, right? So for each use case, you have a more detailed profile, which gives you much more information about the use case, right? So here you have a quick overview of the use case. You can see how it has been how the attention toward that use case has been over time, right? So some of them might be very hyped, others are more stable, and so on. Then you have some business related information, right? So what would be the problem? So in that case, it's inefficient fleet operations. Then what is the solution with AI, right? And then importantly, also what is the outcome of the solution, right? So what are kind of the KPIs that are met and the improvements that you can expect, right? And then importantly, so as I said, it's evidence driven, right? So here you also see a bunch of case studies of real companies that have implemented that use case, right? So you have Stored, which is an automotive company, which I don't know, right? And basically describes the case study that was implemented by the company. And you also always can go on the real article and then basically see how it was implemented, any additional details, and so on, right? And so for many of the use cases, we have like 10 plus case studies that are available, and then you can really go into the details and see how the companies did them exactly. Right, so that's the evidence part. We also have a couple of solutions that are offered for the use case. So kind of, if you want to buy rather than build, right, then you will also find a couple of solutions here. And then, of course, also all the kind of the references that we are using at the back end to build up this use case profile, right? So here you have many different articles that are coming from a diversity of public sources, right? And which really will give you also more details about the use case. Yeah. And so if you want to browse the use cases like in a more open way, right? So not just searching for a specific topic, then this is the catalog, right? So here you have around 230 use cases, and they are all classified by business function, right? So things like operations, finance, product development, IT and DevOps, and so on, by industries, automotive, retail, finance, and so on. And then also by the companies that have implemented them, right? So here it's not yet very complete, but If you're a bigger company and you really want to look at the use cases that were implemented by your competitors, then this is a super useful feature, right? Because then for each of them, you will basically see concrete case studies by these specific companies, right? And then the other thing, so just because we were also talking about this bridge from the actual idea or the use case or the idea into the actual implementation, right? So that's something that we are doing here in this technologies section, right? And there's already, so we are still building out this link between the use cases and then the technologies and the solutions. But one thing that you can already inspect today is this linking to the specific tasks that would need to be implemented for a given use case. So for example, here we are looking at predictive maintenance, right? And then here you see a bunch of those technical tasks that you would need to implement to do it. And you can also go on the profiles of the tasks, right? And then basically get more information. What is the task about? What are the inputs, the outputs? How can it be done? And so on, right? And in general, so what we have found with users is that this implementation checklist, it's a really just a quick checklist, but it can be super helpful at the discovery stage, right? Because it already provides you a high level overview over the technical requirements, right? So the tasks you need to implement, the data you might need to implement the use case, the integrations, the regulations, and then also the risks, right? So that was a quick overview, right? The use cases, then the other thing is the tasks and so on. It's actually part of this technology section. So here you have a whole bunch or a whole universe of more than 500 different technological concepts in AI. I think it's especially interesting for learners, but we will not dive into this today because today we are focusing on AI discovery, right? That was the quick demo. I have a couple of slides here about how the radar was built. I don't think I will go into them now, but I'm happy to share the slides if it's interesting, and then you can review them yourself. So just to summarize the key takeaways, right? We started with proving or seeing that bad discovery or unprepared discovery or kind of very lightweight discovery is one of the major reasons for AI project failure. And then we learned about these two tools that can help you structure and systematize your AI discovery, right? So basically with the AI opportunity tree, you can ideate and present AI use cases in a structured way. And then with the AI radar, you can explore evidence-backed and data-driven AI use cases. That's it. So as said, the radar is publicly available. Please try it out. Get in touch if you have any feedback. And other than that, thanks a lot. And I'm open to your questions.
Yeah, thanks, Jana. We have quite a few questions popping up.
Okay.
Let's take them one by one. So
Sure.
we have one, Mr. Alijwa, asking Jana, you mentioned structured data-driven discovery. So what does that actually look like on a day-to-day for teams without big R&D budgets? And are there lightweight frameworks or tools you recommend for like startups and SMEs?
Well, I would say that the AI radar is obviously a good tool because it's very agile, it's freely available, it's also updated on a weekly basis, right? So you always get up-to-date data about the companies. And then, I think that these are kind of the tools. So if you want to ideate, for example, on the basis of the AI opportunity tree, then just pick one of the articles about it, right? And you can also provide it as context to whatever agent you're using, whether it's Claude or ChatGPT or whatever, and then basically ask it to come up with a bunch of use cases for each of the branches, right? Then, of course, what's super important is quick validation with your users. So if you're developing it internally in your company, then validate it with the domain experts. That's super important. And normally we always ask, the companies that are working with us to involve the domain experts as early as possible, right? So for example, if you talk about predictive maintenance, then we absolutely need to have the technical people who will actually be maintaining those systems to be on board very early in the discovery process. So that's super important. And if you're talking about a user-facing B2C product, then, well, first of all, be careful, because I think that many of these products, they fail, right? Because today it's very easy, again, to vibe code, to prototype something, but then it's super hard to get distribution, right? So the problem kind of has shifted into this whole distribution space. But then I think that like dog fooding is a good approach, right? So maybe building a product for problems that you're facing yourself for the validation, or other than that, again, find a way to find the real users. In the book, I also have a chapter on AI user experiences, right? And I think that's like the crucial thing in B2C space is really on verifying that your user experience is actually accepted and desirable by users, right? Once you have that, so once you have kind of validated this user interface, you can go back and tweak the system and improve the models and optimize and so on. But I think this kind of UX fit is super important in the B2C space.
Thanks, Jana. I think we have one more question. They're asking, hello, Jana, again. So under innovation, you listed AI-driven prototyping. So for teams that aren't development heavy, what tools or frameworks can non-technical people, actually use?
For teams, I didn't get it. For which kind of teams?
Like for development teams, no? If they don't have too many development heavy teams, right? Are there any tools and frameworks which non-technical people can actually use to prototype?
Yeah. So absolutely. So if you're talking about web products, then of course there's the whole bunch of web development agents like Lovable, like Replit, and so on. Vercel, whatever, right? So it's kind of that's kind of the more, let's say, if you're a designer or not so technical person, then of course you can use these to prototype your tools. Then if you're a developer, then I guess you know the tools that you're using, right? So you're using Cursor, Cloud Code, and so on. So those more technical tools that also require you to set up an kind of an infrastructure for coding on your system. But that's the kind of, because I think we have shifted from doing designs and tools like Figma, right, to this kind of more interactive prototyping. I think it's a very good shift because it allows you to validate your ideas much faster and much earlier in the cycle. But definitely for designers or product managers, I would advocate using one of these tools. I've been teaching several AI courses in the past years, especially for non-technical people, so in different domains like financial professionals, real estate professionals, and so on. And in each of these courses, over a couple of days, we have been using these tools, right? So coding agents, and it's really not a big barrier. So I would definitely advise using those.
Thanks, Jana. There's one more question which is on the tip of everybody's tongue. Will AI replace jobs or augment the employees? The threat for everybody,
Yeah.
What do you
I think it will definitely replace some jobs. I think that's inevitable. It's already doing it now, but I think there is no reason to panic if you prepare yourself well, right? So I think that things like taste and intuition and knowing the whole history of your business or of your domain, they will still matter and they will not be replaced by AI, right? So like from my personal experience, whenever I have, of course, we use a lot of AI tools, we use a lot of AI tools in the company for basically everything that we do, more or less. But whenever I do something with AI, I always think about what can I actually add on top of it as a human, right? So both for myself to see that I have made a contribution and it was not just the AI, but also because I know that people on the other end, they can actually sense the difference if they care about it, right? So they can actually sense the difference. And then on the other hand, whenever someone sends me something that's clearly an AI output, then I will normally send it back, right? And it's because it just, otherwise you just get bombarded with all those AI outputs and artifacts, but then kind of the bottom line is that you're still very rural, right? So it's not very successful to just automate everything with AI, right? You still need to contribute this intuition and the taste and the product sense and so on yourself as a human, right? So that's one thing. And then the other thing, I think the audience here is interested in AI in general. So I think that in the decades to come, we will definitely need people designing AI systems, building AI systems, and then also maintaining them over time, right? So kind of, this interface between the domain expertise and then the AI technology on the other hand.
Thanks, Jana. I know you need to go and catch a quick flight, but the last question is from my side, which I always ask, speakers who come from Europe. With so much strict regulations for the IT companies from America, usually that's what I've seen in terms of the kind of, I don't think anyone else, even Google, Meta, Facebook, everybody has had to pay fines in terms of not following the regulatory rules, which are very strict, like your NIST frameworks, NIST frameworks. And right now, if you go and see, right now, even now, OpenAI and other companies are going ahead and using user data. They're scraping the internet with people without any permission or any data privacy laws. They're going ahead and they're getting sued. Politico and New York Times have sued OpenAI, and Meta is already in a court case for actually scraping private data. So how does European mindset have right now? So if you become too strict, then they may fall back or a little lag in this AI race. But you have to be very strict at the same time. You have to be a little flexible. How do you see this approach happening from European side?
Yeah, to be honest, I don't think that Europe has found its way in AI so far. I hope it will, right? But as you say, basically it's so normally, the kind of mental split that I have is that the US is all about the algorithms and the big models. Europe is about the governance and the regulations. And then we have China, which is a lot about the data, right? Also because they have huge data. So that's kind of, the split that I always have in my head. Now in Europe, I think that the AI Act in itself, it's not a very strict thing, right? So if you look at it, then most systems are not high risk systems. And then for the other levels of risk, what you need is just clean operations, clean like DevOps or AI ops. You need everything to be documented and so on. So it's not such a strict thing in itself, right? Then the other thing, so for example, last week I was at a conference in Switzerland, so the SwissTech conference, and there I saw a very strong focus on open source AI models, right? So which Switzerland is building themselves or in cooperation also with the US and so on. So it's quite open still, right? But still there is this kind of focus and this kind of awareness that, okay, eventually we will need models as artifacts that the company can then deploy on their own infrastructure, right? And then basically it can get much safer in that sense. Yeah, so that's I think that might be the kind of technological path for Europe. So really advocating having these more I'm talking about B2B now, right? So less about B2C, but really having those closed systems, which are then hosted on the company's infrastructure. And of course, if you're deploying open source models, then you also get a bunch of advantages beyond the privacy, right? So you also get control, you can fine tune the model, and that's super important, right? Because now you can see already there's all those open AIs and Anthropics and so on. Cost is a big issue, right? Especially with agents, as they start to reason and branch out and so on, you really need to pay a lot for the tokens. If you manage as a company to deploy your own open source models on your servers and then fine tune them over time, then you don't have this variable cost anymore, right? And I believe that's a huge advantage, like looking forward into the future. It's a huge strategic advantage, like in terms of AI for the company.
Thank you so much, Jana. Thank you so much for taking your time off. And I know you have to leave. And to all our participants, please visit iabsc.org to become our authorized training partner. And we'll keep you all posted for all your upcoming events on all our social media channels. And thank you, Hans, for taking time out. Really appreciate it. And thank you so much, Jana. I'll get back to you soon online. Okay. Have a nice flight.